Hello, my name is Brandon Yared, and today for my final module video for biopsychology, I'm here to talk about the case study presented in our textbook which most interested me. The case study that I found most interesting in our textbook by Pinel and Barnes, Biopsychology, 10th edition, was the case of Peter, the split brain patient tormented by conflict. I chose this case study because it's a very dramatic example of compartmentalization of the brain, which has always been very interesting to me because my mother's stepfather, who is the only grandfather I've ever known, even though we're not biologically related, suffered from dissociative identity disorder. At the time he was diagnosed, multiple personality disorder. And growing up, around that was always very fascinating and always raised a lot of questions for me about how more than one state of consciousness could really exist in a single individual. In the case of Peter, the split brain patient who was tormented by conflict, there was a very real physiologically induced compartmentalization between the sides of his brain. And I found that incredibly fascinating and also revealing as to the true nature of ourselves. I think the second reason I chose the case of Peter was because we all have internal conflicts. We all have internal struggles. We're motivated to go to the gym, but we're also lazy and want to stay at home. And we want to eat healthy, but we also want to eat candy bars. And there's all these modes of conflict within each of us. And while it's extreme, Peter's case highlights that some of those conflicts are literal neuronal mechanisms in opposition to one another. And who and how one mechanism prevails over the other, it can be very situational and be about a lot of different components of lateralization and the complex interweaving of who we are. The summary of Peter's case in the biopsychology textbook written by Pinel and Barnes was very brief. And so I went and found the original publication. It was published in 1988 in the Journal of Clinical Psychology by R. Joseph. And Dr. Joseph was reporting on two patients. Now, he didn't name Peter. He referred to the two patients he was comparing as 1-C and 2-C. And 2-C was the case of Peter, as Pinel and Barnes nicknamed him. And for the purpose of this conversation, 2C and Peter are synonymous. So in Joseph's original publication, he was comparing Peter to this other patient. Both had colossomectomies, and each patient had differing symptoms in terms of their left hemisphere extinction. When Peter was 8 years old, he began having seizures, and he would have up to 100 seizures a day. And at the age of 20, he was suffering so much he underwent a colossomectomy. And the colossomectomy had several unexpected consequences. The publication, which Dr. Joseph contributed, was documenting a follow-up with Peter at the age of 23, 3 years after his surgery. What was so remarkable about Peter's case, which was noted by Pinel and Barnes and further elaborated on in the original publication, is that his left and right hemispheres would operate quite independently, with differing intentions, differing will under different tests and scenarios, through stereognosis and through the division of the left and right hemisphere of vision, so that the right brain and the left brain were exposed to different visual stimuli, different pictures, words, digits. And what was amazing was, as long as it was a nonverbal reaction, the right brain could accurately report, up to 90% accurately report via pointing through a selection of options. Meanwhile, the left brain of Peter would consistently report frustration, would continually try to apologize for or make corrections to, beat up his arm, wrestle, cuss at him. In fact, he had cuss at his own limb, and he was completely disassociated from his left field of operation. Now, I was fascinated by this case, but as I read about it more, I was saddened as well, because Peter was identified as being of low intelligence, and in addition to being of low intelligence, the experiments that he was subjected to led him to believe at many times that his left appendage was misbehaving, was inaccurate, when in fact his left appendage, his right brain, had been fed different information than his left brain. There was no details about debriefing or potential treatments or compensatory measures. There was no consideration for the intense suffering that Peter reported, often saying he hated his left side, his left hand. What was also interesting and not reported in the brief summary by Pinel and Barnes is that Peter lacked the ability to form a visual gestalt after surgery. So if you were to ask him to draw a clock, he would draw all the numbers on one side of the clock. For example, take a look at this drawing. This was made by Peter after being asked to draw a clock. Now, his whole psychological conceptual representation has been permanently altered by his colosomectomy. However, whether or not these potential side effects were made perfectly clear to him before surgery is not well documented. So I think that the ethical challenges related to Peter are related to the fact that during testing he was not really briefed well, he was not properly debriefed, there were no attempts made, at least reported, to help him mitigate the negative effects, the lack of visual gestalt, the lack of conceptual gestalt. So in many ways, while one problem was solved, he was permanently damaged and had a significant decrease in quality of life as a result of this study. So it was kind of disappointing to find out that something that was so originally interesting actually had a true trauma and really justified the title that Pinel and Barnes gave to that case study as The Torment of Conflict. The most important things I learned from the case study of Peter is that visual, conceptual, and emotional gestalt require a unification of semi-lateralized functions of the brain. I also learned that consciousness and willful intent can be compartmentalized very literally in the human body, in the human mind. And finally, I feel like the study of this abnormal operation of Peter contributes to our understanding of the internal conflict that we all experience between different emotions, different tendencies, different desires, and how those different neuronal structures compete to ultimately result in the behaviors that we express. This case study and really this whole course has forced me to think about who I am differently and biopsychology as a field differently. I think modern biopsychology challenges us to take our ego out of our perception of our experience and admit that we are nothing more than the sum of our parts. And when we do that, we have to now look at the universe within us, the microscopic galaxy of connections and competitions and potentials that intersect and overlap and compete to ultimately result in who we are, which is, of course, ever-changing. Neuroplasticity and the study in this text, in this case, have reshaped my perspective on the self. And it really leads back to me to a more Eastern view of there is no self, of trying to be of no mind, which is something that I can appreciate and I'm going to try to take forward with me as I integrate my understanding of modern biopsychology, the summation of our parts, and how we are no less amazing as creatures and as beings for the microcosm of interactions that generate ourselves. Thank you for a wonderful course.